your history.
Hart is next.
This investigation is over.
What happened to him, it's gross. It's horrible.
We are talking FANGS from 2002, and this is a killer bat movie. I did a little bit of a marathon buying session of killer bat movies and decided to review them all, and this is one of them. So FANGS, this is directed by Kelly Sandifleur and stars Corbin, Bernsen, who I think is probably the most recognisable name here, Tracy Nelson and Whip Hubley. So it's actually very similar in regards to plot to the 1999 movie simply called Bats that starred Lou Diamond Phillips. Essentially the plot here is there is a kind of university, kind of museum place where this doctor has been housing hundreds of bats. Now, unbeknownst to the kind of populace at large, these bats are genetically kind of altered, and one day these kind of bats end up kind of getting out and go on a bit of a killing spree, targeting seemingly specific people. We have Corbin Bernsen's character is the kind of the evil kind of like property mogul who is, you know, swindling people out of their money, and it comes down to the local veterinarian who kind of doubles as animal control, a cop and a couple of teenagers to try and put a stop to this winged menace. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So let's talk about what I think works in this film. So, like I've said, the plot is very, very similar to the aforementioned Bats from 1999. So plot-wise, it's, you know, nothing really to speak home about. This does have a lighter tone. This is more of a kind of, I wouldn't say a horror comedy exactly, but it's certainly more comedic. This reminds me, in regards to tone, it reminds me so much of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV show. If you were a fan of that show, it just kind of feels like it's part of that universe. It's the best way to describe it. There's nothing really supernatural here, but just the kind of the tone, the way they're kind of like these kind of teenagers are, the kind of like the goofy adults who are kind of constantly kind of like sort of overacting and kind of like have these kind of like humorous lines. It really does feel like you're watching a kind of spin-off, so to speak, of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So if you're a fan of that TV show, then you may want to check this one out. Because this has a lighter tone than, say, the aforementioned Bats, it makes our kind of protagonists, for example, quite likeable. You know, we have this this guy who's a veterinarian, and he's got, you know, he's a widower, and he's now kind of sparking up a romance with this kind of female cop. They have a good chemistry. They have a good kind of relationship with these two teenagers, one of which is this guy's daughter. So everyone, you know, our protagonists are all quite likeable, and they're very light kind of characters, written very kind of like jovially. And our human bad guy, Corbin Bernsen, is like, you know, real like boo hiss villain who's like very slimy and things like that. So all the characters here are quite broad, but very kind of like well defined, shall we say, in their kind of roles. Despite this movie not being a gory film compared to some of the other Bat films that I've mentioned, this one is the effects are pretty good. I will say. I mean, it's a kind of a mix of kind of you know, practical and kind of CGI effect, mainly kind of CGI, to be honest. But I don't think the CGI looks too bad, especially for a film of its age. You know, they're certainly, I think, well. You know, fit well with the kind of the live action kind of sequences, and they don't sort of stick out too much. So, you know, considering this is a movie at this point I'm doing this review, which is over 20 years old, I got to say I thought the effects here were reasonable, and there's kind of plenty of you know, action with kind of bat attacks, and you also have this mystery about, you know, who's actually behind these bats. Is there a kind of a shadowy figure that's actually responsible and controlling these bats even? So there's some kind of things to kind of get your teeth into in regards to the kind of the plot here. But let's talk about what I think doesn't work. Like I said, the plot here, outside of a few bells and whistles, is very, very similar to Bats from 1999. It just doesn't. I mean, I guess there's only so many kind of permeations you can potentially have with a movie like that. It's like shark movies. People always say, "Oh, it's a Jaws ripoff," but it's kind of you have to have certain things for it to kind of work as a film. So, you know, there's only so many differences you can really have in a film which has a very specific kind of animal protagonist. So yeah, but it is a kind of a similar film, that being said. I think the main issue I have with this one is it really doesn't differentiate itself. I mean, like I say, Bats had a much higher production value. Roost had you know, a bit more of a genuine kind of horror edge to it and was kind of scary. And there was the Vampire Bats one, which I think played a little bit more kind of dramatic. It just feels a little bit fluffy, a little bit kind of generic, to be honest with you. But let me just go into a little bit more detail. Part of this issue, I think, is this is largely a bloodless affair. They decided to go for, like I've said, this kind of Buffy the Vampire TV feel, and as such there's really no gore in this one. We don't really see any type of you know, actual kind of like mutilated bodies or kind of these vampire bats kind of biting into people, things like that. None of that's in it. The only one we really do see is these bats attacking this dog, which is done fairly well, but you know, that's kind of it. There's not much else to it in regards to gore or actual horror elements to it. It's very, very light. The characters, they're quite fun, I admit it, but they are a little bit too kind of like goofy to be taken seriously. So this movie lacks any of the kind of the drama that may have, you know, been evoked from other films like this. There's no real fear factor in this movie. It's too light. The performances are too kind of comedic to be taken at any type of dramatic level. And yeah, they kind of, you know, they seem like likeable characters, but they're not kind of realistic characters by any sense of the imagination. And arguably, you could say that, you know, that there's a degree of overacting here, which might put kind of people off as well. And it's fairly kind of obvious when you think of, you know, maybe who the actual kind of antagonist is. It kind of thinks, man, you know, it's fairly kind of obvious here what's kind of going on, and it just takes too many liberties. You know, I mean, I've mentioned Jaws. I mean, this is like a typical thing where there's this kind of like the local town is having some type of event, and you know, the authorities don't want anyone to disrupt the event and kind of trying to kind of like hush up this cop and things like this. It's Jaws, you know, it's the same kind of, you know, it's the same kind of plot points that you've seen before. So it doesn't have any real originality. It's a fun time waster if you just want a very non-offensive, a very kind of like, you know, mellow kind of horror film, which isn't going to kind of like be too scary. It's probably okay for kind of for kids, but for the more discerning horror fan, for the more kind of ardent fan of kind of animal attacks and kind of like scares, this is just a little bit too light. It's a little bit too all that you've seen before. It doesn't offer anything new in its place. I wouldn't say it's a bad film, but to me it's a below average. I'll give this one a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.